Hi and welcome to this video in the QPSMR Companion Digging Deeper series. And in this video we're going to be looking at the response settings that you have available when you're entering your questions in the QPSMR Companion. So let's just open up a question here. I should say before I start, there are no files associated with this particular video because it's more of a tour around just introducing you to the different tools that you have available when setting up your questionnaire. So let's go into a questionnaire. Now, all the things I'm going to show you today only apply to these two types of entry here, but also apply to variables with those two types of entry. So everything I talk about here with questions, with single coded responses or multi-coded responses, is equally applicable to variables as well. So we're going to start with a multi-response question here and then just take a look round at the different settings that we can have. So let's say that this question is, which brands have you heard of? And we can key into here that the responses are brand A, brand B, brand C, brand D, and none of these. So we've got 5 brands here to work on. All right, so in another video, we've covered the question and the settings and the extra settings that you have associated with the question as a whole. And in a separate video, again, we've covered filters, so that filters are covered in a separate video. This video is very much about looking at what you can set for individual responses. And if you go into the input and analysis options down here, you'll find that you've got these options here for input and these options here for analysis, and they apply to individual responses. So typically you click on one of these answers here, one of the responses, and then you apply whichever options you particularly want for that particular question. So let's start with the input settings and look at what we've got as we work around the screen. So single response only. So this applies only to multiple response questions, this option here. There you are, you can just check it on like that and check it off like that. It wouldn't be applicable to brand A here, or be unlikely to apply applicable to brand A, but what it has a purpose for is the none of these option here, because you only want to allow that code if there isn't a brand mentioned. It doesn't make sense to say brand A and none of these. So this you might apply to the 5th response here, and you would check it, and you can see the options always appear here on the worksheet. As you come out, you can see the input settings that you've made, or the input settings that you have here, and they're only applicable typically to one response. What else have we got? Well, we've got fixed position. What does that mean? Well, a fixed position means that if you randomize the responses, this particular response would stay where it is. So we might apply that as well to the none of these option, because if when we're doing a CAPI or a CATI interview, we wanted to randomize the order that the brands appeared, we almost certainly would want to leave none of these at the bottom, because it doesn't look right when none of these appears anywhere else in the list. So that's another response setting that's very applicable to the none of these in this particular case. What else have we got? Well, we've got ignore response restrictor here as a checkbox that we can choose. Now, what that means is that the response is available at data entry or data input, even if the response restrictor specifies that it shouldn't be available. So it's like an override. So there are different ways that you can hide a response so they're not available at data entry, but this will override it so that it is available at data entry. The next option on the list here is a response filter. So this is a filter that only applies to this particular response. It's not a filter on the whole question. The topic of filters is covered more fully in our filters video, But this means that you only want certain people to be able to choose this particular response. So you might say the only people that could choose brand A are people that mentioned it at a previous question, for example. So you could filter the response, and only that response, on a previous answer to one or more questions. Embedded rejects, the next item on the list here. And what an embedded reject means is that if no responses are chosen, this is the response that people default to. So again, for none of these, we might want to do this. So we could say that if somebody didn't answer this question, they automatically fall into the none of these category. Now that's not the same as choosing down here a supplemental reject, which means that you're going to have an additional, if you like, hidden code where anybody who doesn't answer the question goes into that hidden code. So if you wanted to differentiate between people that said none of these and those that didn't give an answer, you would choose a supplemental code. But if you wanted to put anybody who didn't give an answer into the none of these category, we could just check on this again, choose the input option, and choose the embedded reject so that people got put into that code even if they didn't answer that particular code. Now, refuse input, this means that the response is not valid, and it means that it's not listed or not shown during data input. So this means this is a way of, if you like, reserving response numbers. So if you wanted to have codes 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 on your available at question input and 9, but you didn't want 6, 7, 8 to show, you could have 6, 7, 8 as dummy entries that were then not allowed at data entry and could not be captured at data entry. So that's a way of using that. Suspend input, the next checkbox, which is sort of just above it, the refuse input there. What that means is the response is no longer available for data entry. So it's perhaps a code that did exist. It might be a brand that's no longer available, for example. So you want to preserve that code when it comes to analysis and show it in analysis, but it's no longer available. So it's a code that has existed with some of the data that you've already collected typically, but you don't want to use it anymore. So therefore, you're suspending input. Then we come routing after response. So rather like on a question, you can have routing instructions. You can have a code or some text to appear on a printed questionnaire to give people a clue where they've got to go. And they can close as a result of that or be ineligible. And so you can send them to a particular question, or you could have a piece of text that gives an instruction of where to go, but it really applies to a printed questionnaire. So there are the response settings that we have. Next to this, we've got an analysis box where we have some analysis options. So let's click on those and have a look and see what we can do down the analysis options. So let's click on here. So the first one here is suppressive 0. So if we check this box here for the none of these, what it would mean is that when we come to produce analysis, this particular item, none of these, would only appear if there was some data or there was one or more respondents that fell in to that particular category. So if it was 0, it would just be hidden, but if it's not 0, it would appear on your analysis and tables. This checkbox here means that you just want to hide that particular response. So it's only analysis. These are analysis settings, so it would only hide it at analysis. It will be available in input, but it would hide it at analysis. So it'd be a way of masking that, if you like, or not showing that on tables. Then we come to the ranking options, and they do have some use here again. So I could, for example, choose this option here and start ranking here, and I might end ranking or finish ranking here. Now what this means, if we just widen that to look at, what this means is that The first four answers, brand A, B, C, and D, would be ranked on any analysis. So the highest ranked answer would go to the top. So if brand B had the highest number or percentage, that would go to the top of a table. Whereas the lowest, let's say that's brand A with just 15% rather than all the other brands having more than 15%, that would go to the bottom of the table. But it would end at brand D. So it wouldn't rank none of these because it doesn't look good, generally speaking, if none of these goes up the table. It just looks out of place. Whereas it does make sense to show the brands in descending order, starting with the highest first and the lowest last. So that's the ranking options. Let's go back into analysis. Now, score value, if you want to apply a score to a particular response, that's not appropriate here. But say you had very good to very poor, this is a way that you can apply a score to each response. So you could say that very good was 5, quite good was 4, average was 3, quite poor was 2, and very poor was 1. And then on any tables that you produce, your data would automatically be scored, and any response you don't put a score on would get excluded from any statistical calculations, including mean score. So you have to check that box there and put in the value in here, and that would be applied. Now that doesn't make any sense here on a question that is just brands A, B, C, and D, but would on other types of questions. Now, there is a better way to input the scores you want. If you put the scores on the end of the text when you enter the response, so you put very good space 5, you can then use that as a score that's automatically applied, which is a better way of doing it than here. This is a way, if you like, of adding it on after you perhaps input the question because you forgot. So this is not the best way to do scores. There's other ways of doing it. This item here, new page, is more commonly used with banners or long lists where you want to choose at which response you break and have a new page. Typically you don't care because QPSMR Companion will automatically page things onto new pages where it needs to if you're printing to a text file, but sometimes you want to choose where it splits the page, and so that checkbox will split it at that particular response. Now, base for following items is something I actually warn people not to do unless they really understand what it's doing. It will mean on tables that the row that you put this on, all the subsequent rows will get percentaged on that particular value. So if we did put this on brand B, for example, it would mean that brand C and D would be percentaged on the figure for brand B, which would clearly be nonsense. It really is mainly used in variables where you perhaps have a question like a yes-no question, and then the second part is filtered on the people who said yes. So you might build a variable that went yes, no, then you put in yes again, and you would put base the following on the yes so that the following items were re-percentaged, if you like, or only percentaged on the yeses. Now that's a fairly rare thing that you need. It's quite a powerful thing to be able to do, but it needs to be used with care. This checkbox here means that when you do analysis, you don't get the figures, you only get the percentages. So if there's a row or rows in your tables where you don't want figures to be, you only want percentages and don't want figures to be applied, you can just apply that checkbox. Sometimes you want to make a sum of the rows above you. So let's say we wanted to get a total count on our brands. We could add a dummy row into our question here, or more typically into our variable here, so that we could sum the rows and get a total count of the number of answers that were given. And if we wanted to ignore certain rows from that sum, we would need to put that on the rows that we wanted to ignore. So, for example, you might want to get a sum of rows to make sure something adds to 100%. But if there's a subtotal in your variable of very good or quite good, you would want to exclude that. Otherwise, you'll be double counting the quite good and the very good. So that takes you around to the response settings. If you want to know about what's going on, as I said, in the question, extra or the settings, there's a video under question settings. For filters, there's a video on how to apply filters. So that completes this video on analysis settings. Hope it's useful to you. There's a whole library of videos that are available in our QPSMR companion series and in this particular Digging Deeper series. Thanks for joining me.